And the events that followed, chronicled well in his own confessions, were unprecedented in the whole history of the Christian church up to that point. Never before had any nation converted wholesale to the Christian faith in a single generation. Never before had any nation converted without violence. There were no Irish murders. And never before had a culture been so radically transformed in the course of a single generation. This illiterate, barbarous, nomadic, inclined to piracy, thieving, and cattle rustling people were suddenly transformed into a seat of learning, an engine of productivity, and a launching place for global missions in a single generation. And the stories that quickly emerged of the disciples of Patrick, men like Brendan who got into a small leather-bottomed boat and literally explored the world, probably reaching the shores of America. We know that he reached the shores of the Faroes and the Canaries and perhaps as far as Iceland and Greenland. Spreading abroad wherever he went the good news of Christ, planting churches all along the way, depositing his fellow adventurers. The stories that followed of Columba establishing a mission station on the tiny island of Iona, which ultimately became the staging place for an outreach to all of the Scots who, as Danny pointed out a moment ago, were really just the same folks as the Irish, just with a little bit better music and a little better food. But soon the Scots were swept into this rising tide of the gospel hope, and the seats of learning were established. Once illiterate people became the keepers of the traditions of the West. While libraries were vanishing all throughout Europe, and places like Alexandria were going up in flames, and Athens was a shell of its former self, and Rome was all but abandoned. Little places like Iona and Lindisfarne became the repositories of the great literature of the West. All cultures have their hero tales. And the hero tales of the Irish, though they are stimulating and though they are familiar, were not the only tales that are told. Why is it then that these tales are told more often than most of the others? What is it that makes these Celts, these Irish and their Scots and their Scots-Irish heirs so distinctive? The explanation, according to Thomas Cahill, is an oddity of history. See, the Irish were converted at the same time as the collapse of the old Roman order. The keepers of tradition and order and knowledge and vision for a millennium found the imperium descending into darkness and chaos. Meanwhile, the Irish and their Scots heirs were just coming into the life of faith. While political structures, military preparedness, commercial distribution, transportation and communication were all collapsing all around the Mediterranean, while urban centers were emptying, academies and libraries were quickly disappearing, the Irish were just discovering the marvels of this rich tradition. In their conversion, they'd never been Romanized, but they loved all of the rich stories mysteries and the marvels of the manuscripts. They found the reading of poetry almost magical, more powerful than even their bardic traditions of storytelling. And so suddenly the Irish became the keepers of the flame. While the rest of Europe was descending into chaos, while Byzantium was closing itself in and guarding its borders and turning inward, the Irish were just discovering the love of books. There's a great throwaway line in Thomas Cahill's narrative, How the Irish Saved Civilization, where he says, in a time of chaos, men don't create books. They don't maintain libraries. They don't believe the word is important. Survival is what they focus on. As a result, Cahill says, there are these peculiar moments in history, odd times, unpredictable, where on the margins of society, at the edges of the world, the most unlikely people take up the most unlikely course of action. They decide, against all reason and against the rising tide of popular opinion, they decide that they will keep the words. And according to Cahill, it's in precisely those moments that the future hope of the world is secured. Part of the reason the Irish rise above all of their likely peers among men and nations, according to Cahill, is precisely because this peculiar moment in history enabled them to lay hold of the rich inheritance. They recognized it for what it was, and they kept it. They preserved it. They loved it. They cherished it. They internalized it. While the library at Alexander burned to the ground in ashes, a handful of formerly illiterate Irish Christians were painstakingly copying down the great manuscripts from the great books of the Christian and the classical tradition, and thus that tradition was saved. It's marvelous. John Knox, the great Scottish reformer, offered another explanation as to why the Irish and the Scots heirs after them seemed to be so prominent in the affairs of men and nations. He said, the uniqueness of the Celtic Church is actually the reason. It was the Celtic Church, Knox said, that brought to life a vision of an incarnational gospel, a gospel that changed the whole of life, that left no thing untouched. The Celtic Church was the first de-Romanized, de-Byzantinized church. The Irish were never assimilated into the imperium. Therefore, their conversion was not mediated through cultural structures. The barbarians